In the quaint town of Willow's End, the annual harvest parade was a cherished tradition. Each autumn, floats adorned with pumpkins, corn husks, and scarecrows rolled down the cobbled streets, accompanied by townsfolk dressed in elaborate costumes. Laughter, music, and cheers filled the crisp evening air, making it the highlight of the season. But this year felt different. As dusk settled and the parade began, an eerie silence replaced the usual fanfare. The floats glided down the street, their wheels creaking like distant whispers. The participants, usually lively and cheerful, marched stiffly, their faces obscured by strange masks. The masks were grotesque, blank eyes, twisted mouths, and expressions that seemed frozen in terror. At first, the townsfolk assumed it was a creative twist, an attempt to make the parade spookier than usual. But as the procession moved through the heart of town, unease rippled through the crowd. The participants didn't wave, they didn't speak. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, and their footsteps fell in an unnervingly synchronized rhythm. When one child tugged on the sleeve of a passing marcher, the figure froze and turned its head slowly, revealing empty eye sockets beneath its mask. The child screamed, and the marcher resumed its stiff procession, as if nothing had happened. Whispers spread among the crowd. "Who are they? Where's Mr. Halloway? He's always the lead float driver. Why does it feel so cold?" As the parade continued, a strange fog seeped into the streets, muffling sounds and obscuring the participants. The air grew heavy, and a chilling realization began to dawn on the townsfolk. They didn't recognize any of the marchers. An older woman named Marla, who had lived in Willow's End her entire life, began to tremble. "Those masks," she murmured. "I've seen them before, in the graveyard." Her words sent a ripple of panic through the crowd, but no one dared move. Some tried to leave, but the fog thickened, making the streets unfamiliar and disorienting. The parade reached the town square, where it usually ended with a lively dance. But this time, the participants formed a circle, their heads tilting unnaturally upward as if listening to something only they could hear. Then, they began to hum, a low, droning sound that vibrated in the townsfolk's chests. Suddenly, a young man in the crowd screamed. His voice cut off mid-cry, and he clutched his throat. His friends turned to help him, but he was already stepping toward the circle, his movements stiff, his eyes wide and unseeing. One by one, others followed, as if an invisible force was pulling them into the procession. Sheriff Callahan tried to intervene, shouting, "Everyone back to your homes!" But his voice faltered as he locked eyes with a marcher whose mask crumbled, revealing a decayed skeletal face. The sheriff dropped his flashlight and stumbled backward, his own voice silenced. Those who tried to look away felt a compulsion to turn back, their gazes drawn to the haunting circle. It was as if the parade demanded to be seen, and the longer they watched, the stronger the pull became. A desperate few managed to flee into their homes, barricading doors and drawing curtains. Through the cracks, they could see neighbors and loved ones disappearing into the fog, their faces frozen in silent terror as they joined the parade. By midnight, the fog lifted, and the streets were empty. The circle of marchers was gone, leaving only faint footprints and the lingering scent of decay. The next morning, the town was eerily quiet. Those who had survived ventured outside, finding abandoned belongings strewn along the parade route. No one spoke of what they had seen, but in the town square, a new statue stood. A grotesque figure of a masked marcher, holding a lantern that seemed to glow faintly in the daylight. Every year after, the harvest parade continued, but no one dared watch. Curtains stayed drawn, doors remained locked, and the streets were left to the silent procession of the dead. In the picturesque village of Eldermere, nestled in a misty valley, the midnight bell was more than a symbol. It was a lifeline. Every year, on the last night of October, the villagers would gather in the town square to ring the colossal, centuries-old bell at precisely midnight. They believed the bell's deep, resonant chime kept the shadowkin, malevolent spirits that prowled the surrounding woods, at bay. For generations, the ritual had gone uninterrupted, its origins shrouded in folklore and mystery. Most villagers dismissed the Shadowkin as mere superstition, but no one dared to defy tradition. This year, however, a fierce storm swept through Eldermere just days before the ritual. Lightning struck the bell tower, splitting the ancient wood and sending the bell crashing to the ground. The once mighty bell lay shattered, its fragments scattered across the square. "Perhaps the Shadowkin will leave us alone," scoffed the mayor, trying to soothe the villagers' growing unease. But an oppressive tension hung in the air, and whispers of fear spread like wildfire. The night the bell would have rung, a farmer named Edwin failed to return home. His wife found his boots near the edge of the forest, along with strange, clawed footprints leading deeper into the trees. By morning, the whispers had turned to panic. That evening, the village blacksmith, Marin, vanished as well. Her forge was left cold and dark, but witnesses claimed to see a grotesque, shadowy figure wandering the square, its movements jerky, its form shrouded in shifting darkness. By the third night, the villagers began locking their doors and windows, but it was no use. Each morning, another home was found empty, its occupants replaced by misshapen, shadowy doppelgangers that wandered the village, their hollow eyes radiating malice. Among the terrified villagers, 4 teens, Clara, Owen, Leah, and Felix, decided they couldn't sit idly by. Clara, whose grandfather had been the village historian, remembered his cryptic stories about the midnight bell. "The bell wasn't just for protection," she whispered to the group. "It was a warning." Together they combed through the old man's notes, discovering references to a pact made centuries ago. Eldermere's founders had struck a deal with the Shadowkin. The bell's chime would keep the spirits confined to the forest, but if the bell ever fell silent, the Shadowkin would claim the village for their own. The notes hinted at a forgotten ritual that could repair the pact, but the instructions were incomplete. The only clue was a map of the forest, leading to a place ominously labeled the Cradle of Shadows. Armed with lanterns, the teens ventured into the forest. The air grew colder with each step, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, accompanied by faint whispers that grew louder as they approached their destination. They reached a clearing where the earth seemed to breathe, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. At its center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface carved with symbols matching those on the bell's fragments. As the group examined the altar, a low growl echoed around them. From the shadows emerged the Shadowkin, grotesque, amorphous creatures that shifted between human and beast. Their hollow, glowing eyes locked onto the teens, their claws glinting in the moonlight. Clara frantically deciphered the symbols, realizing they needed to recite an incantation while offering a token from the bell. Felix, carrying a fragment he'd picked up in the square, placed it on the altar. As they began the chant, the Shadowkin grew agitated, circling closer. Leah screamed as one lunged toward her, but Owen swung a torch, driving it back. The chant grew louder, their voices trembling as the air around them seemed to shatter like glass. The bell fragment began to glow, and a deafening chime filled the clearing, forcing the Shadowkin to retreat. But the ritual wasn't complete. The symbols on the altar revealed a final, chilling truth. A life must be willingly offered to seal the pact. The group hesitated, the realization sinking in. Felix stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "If we don't do this, the entire village is doomed," he said. Before anyone could stop him, Felix placed his hand on the glowing fragment. The light enveloped him, and the Shadowkin let out a collective wail as they dissolved into the forest. Felix's figure shimmered, then vanished, leaving behind only the fragment, now whole and gleaming. The teens returned to the village, placing the repaired bell in the square. When they rang it, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the remaining shadowy doppelgangers dissolved into mist. Eldermere was saved, but the cost lingered heavily in their hearts. Each year as the midnight bell rang out, Clara, Owen, and Leah stood at the edge of the square, listening for the faint sound of Felix's voice in the chime. Martin Decker was a struggling ventriloquist whose career had dwindled to small-town gigs and half-empty bars. One rainy afternoon, he wandered into a dingy thrift store, hoping to find something unique to refresh his act. In a dimly lit corner, he spotted it. An antique ventriloquist's puppet, its paint chipped, but its expression disturbingly lifelike. Its wide, unblinking eyes seemed to follow him as he approached. "Ah, I see you found him," said the shopkeeper, a wiry old man with a crooked smile. "That's Chester. He's been here a long time, waiting for the right owner." Martin felt an odd pull toward the puppet. Despite its eerie aura, it felt like destiny. "How much?" he asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, then smirked. "For you, just $20, but remember, Chester has character." Martin laughed nervously, paid, and left with the puppet under his arm. His first show with Chester was electric. The puppet seemed to come alive, delivering jokes Martin hadn't even rehearsed. The audience was captivated, their laughter louder and more genuine than he'd heard in years. After the show, Chester sat on a chair in Martin's motel room, his painted eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Good job tonight," Martin said, chuckling as he wiped sweat from his brow. "That's because I carried you," a voice replied, deep and raspy. Martin froze. He turned slowly toward the puppet, convinced he was imagining things. "You're welcome, by the way," Chester continued, his wooden mouth moving. Martin staggered back, his pulse racing. You can talk?" Chester's grin seemed to widen. "Oh, I can do much more than that. Stick with me and you'll be a star. But we'll need to make some arrangements." Martin laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it as a stress-induced hallucination. But Chester spoke again. "I give, you take. That's how this works. And now, I need something in return." Martin tried to ignore the puppet, but Chester's voice grew louder, more insistent. At first, the demands were minor. Stealing a bottle of whiskey from the motel bar, picking up a knife he didn't need from a pawn shop. Each time Martin obeyed, Chester seemed to perform better, his jokes sharper, his delivery flawless. But then Chester's requests became darker. One night, after another sold-out show, Chester whispered, "You see that man in the front row? He's rich. Follow him. Take what he has." Martin recoiled. "I'm not doing that. This is crazy." "Then maybe the act falls flat tomorrow. Maybe you fall flat too." Chester's painted grin seemed to twist into a sneer. Desperate to maintain his newfound success, Martin followed the man and stole his wallet. The act left him shaking, but the next show was even better than the last. Chester's presence on stage was magnetic, almost hypnotic, and Martin's fame began to grow. But the puppet's demands escalated. Chester wanted blood. "Just a small sacrifice," he hissed one night, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "A homeless man. No one will miss him." Martin tried to resist, but Chester tormented him relentlessly, whispering in his ear every waking moment. Finally, broken and terrified, Martin gave in. Under Chester's direction, he lured a drifter into an alley. When it was over, Chester laughed, his voice echoing in Martin's mind. The next day, Martin woke to headlines praising his performance, calling him a genius and the best ventriloquist of his generation. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and his nights were plagued with nightmares of Chester's cruel laughter. As Martin's fame grew, so did Chester's control. The puppet began moving on its own, appearing in places Martin hadn't left him. One night, Martin woke to find Chester perched on his chest, his wooden hands pressing down. "You're mine now," Chester whispered. "You're nothing without me." Martin's final breaking point came during a live television performance. As the cameras rolled, Chester began speaking lines Martin hadn't rehearsed, dark, twisted confessions that mirrored Martin's recent crimes. The audience gasped, then laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the act. Martin tried to stop Chester, but the puppet's voice grew louder, overpowering his own. His hand felt locked in place, unable to drop the puppet. Chester turned to Martin, his grin wide and menacing. "Let me show them the real you," Chester growled. In a desperate bid for freedom, Martin grabbed the puppet and slammed it against the stage, shattering its wooden body. The audience screamed, thinking it was all part of the show. But as the puppet splintered, a dark, shadowy figure emerged, twisting and writhing in the air. The shadow lunged at Martin, engulfing him as the cameras went dark. The next day, the show's producers found the stage empty, save for Chester, completely intact and sitting upright, his painted grin wider than ever. Martin Decker was never seen again, but Chester's legend lived on. The puppet appeared in another thrift store months later, waiting for its next owner.